Okay, thank you, Catherine. My name is Rebecca Ciro. I'm the evaluation specialist with Washington State University Extension. In my position, I have a statewide obligation, and so I work quite a bit with community development. And so I've had the wonderful opportunity to be part of the National Community Resource and Economic Development Indicators team, which you can see listed there. I know several of them have joined us today. And so welcome to them, as well to the rest of you across the nation who are taking time out of your day to get together with us. There are 14 of us on the team around the country. And you can see there's a brief map there that sort of spaces us out. So you can see generally where we are currently located. We're always looking for additional people who are interested in joining us and getting familiar with the work we're doing. Primarily what our existence in essence is to tell more compelling stories at the state, local, and national levels about the work that we're doing within our community and economic development. So we get together monthly to talk about ways to improve our ability to gather and assess collective impacts and to leverage our strengths to develop support for CRED programming within our individual states and our regions, as well as make strategic decisions regarding value and importance and things that we should be focusing on as a group. We have several goals that we've set as a group. Primarily, what we focus on is to identify promising practices within evaluation tools to use and share within each other, as well as spread that beyond our group. We've gotten together to collaborate on key numeric indicators to aggregate, and we'll be talking briefly about that today, and then moving into how we're also looking to now do that qualitatively in addition to quantitatively. People within individual states and regions work within their own extension directors, as well as writing reports, impact reports within their states. We also feel it's important to keep focus on the public value of CRED programs. CRED is often a program that tends to get talked about last when we talk about extension, and so we believe one of our roles is to ensure it stays on the forefront of people's minds and awareness. And then finally, we're looking to build capacity for CRED evaluation impact and reporting to help increase that visibility, as I mentioned. So one of the ways we do that is that there's a website that Catherine shared at the beginning, and then we'll be sharing it again at the end. And then we also do exactly what we're doing today, which is to develop and deliver webinars to help disseminate information. So with that, I'll go ahead and move on to what specifically we'll be talking about today. So our title is Evaluating Community Development Impacts Using Qualitative Indicators. As I mentioned, my name is Rebecca Ciro. I'll go ahead and let Paul introduce himself.
Hi all, Paul LaChapelle. I'm with Montana State University Extension. I'm the Extension Specialist and Program Leader here for Montana. We just have one specialist, that's me, and three full-time extension agents in the fields that have exclusive community and economic development responsibilities. Nice to be with you.
Thanks, Paul. So we thought it would be useful as we talk about community development and qualitative research and evaluation, we thought it would be useful to come at it with two different approaches. So as the evaluation specialist at Washington State, I mentioned the idea that I have a statewide obligation and a statewide perspective. So at the core, I am the evaluator here at Washington State. And so I am a qualitative researcher. That's sort of my heart and soul. And I thought it would be helpful to, a couple years ago, I kind of created this concept of it would be useful to come up with more of a qualitative approach to looking at work happening within community development. Paul, as a community developer and a researcher himself, has actually had the opportunity to take a qualitative approach to some of the work he's doing. So I'll be talking a little bit about the theoretical framework that I've created and have piloted recently, and then Paul will take the opportunity to talk to you about data from the actual field that he's done as well. So as I mentioned, we are a national work group. We work in conjunction with NIFA. Aida Balsano is the NIFA rep who we have the wonderful, have the opportunity to work with. There's 4 regions and 13 members. A couple years ago, and this was prior to me joining, the CRED work group came up with a set of quantitative indicators. And really the overall goal was to measure the impact of work quantitatively. And the thought was, if we can find ways to measure across region and across states, then we would be able to do more comparative work than we are now, and really be able to aggregate work in a way that we haven't prior to. So they came up with a number of quantitative measures, things like the dollar value of resources leveraged, the number of jobs that have been retained within a community, the number of leadership roles undertaken, and all of that is important and has been very, very useful. I'm coming at it in a little bit different way. So when I joined the group, I was interested to learn more about the quantitative aspect, but for me, I really wanted to understand the context behind the numbers. I wanted to understand the story. And so this is an opportunity. What I'll be sharing with you today is a framework that I've created that helps to enable community development, whether you work within Extension or outside of Extension, community developers to find ways to track the work they're doing and to understand it, not only quantitatively, but qualitatively as well. So I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about specifically the approach. I came up with it a couple years ago, but I wanted to at least provide you all with the opportunity so that you sort of understood where it came from, and it's not just something that I dreamt up one day. It's actually based on a variety of theories and framework that I came up with using a little bit of a blended lens. So I have a sociological background, so using sociological theory and thinking about Durkheim and his concept of examining how community elements influence behavior and consciousness, that contributed to it. Community development theory, which if you work within communities, you're likely familiar with this theory, the idea that the community exists as a complex and dynamic system. Community capitals framework, of course. You can't talk about community development work without understanding and really exploring more of the work that Flora and Flora came up with. And then, of course, a little bit different and outside of the arena, but I went into the civic engagement arena and looked at some outcomes that people were measuring and creating through that. And their idea was to measure change through social impact. And so I thought it added a certain flavor and specialty to this qualitative approach that I wasn't getting from just looking at a community development lens. So in essence, I came up with 5 conceptual categories that I want to talk to you about today. And really what I wanted to understand was, when thinking about how does community development work and how does the work within your community, the work you're all doing, how does it, number one, impact or increase the knowledge and awareness that community members are gaining as a result of your work. This is, if you're an evaluator or you're familiar with evaluation techniques, this is in essence a short-term outcome. What is it that people know? I also wondered, how does community development impact the behavior and participation? How does it grow that? So these are things that, what are people doing differently now that they weren't doing before as a result of the work that you've come in and worked with them on in your community. The third conceptual category is to foster discourse. And this concept is sort of the idea of, what are people saying and hearing? The fourth conceptual category was the idea to build capacity. Oftentimes when you come into a community and you're working with community members, one of the goals is to build capacity in some way. So this is ways that the know-how and the resources are being changed as a result of the work. And of course, none of this is to assume that you, quote unquote, as the community developer, are the only one doing the work. We work within communities with the idea that we're working with our community members in tandem and not necessarily all by yourself. So sort of the idea of, how as a group are you building capacity? How are you as a group building the resources? And then the final conceptual category is what has been the impact on systems, policies, and conditions. So this would be sort of what is the lasting change as a result of the community development work. And that's a long-term outcome for anyone who's familiar with thinking about evaluation from that perspective. So these are the categories that I created with the idea that if we could go into a community and start to measure each of these categories, we would be able to understand better the work that has happened and gained stories that we could then use to tell our funders, our grantors, whoever it may be, our community, other community leaders, our county commissioners, whoever it may be, they could better understand why we were there, how we were helping, the things that we were doing. So how can we qualitatively measure how community development has helped to, for example, increase knowledge and change? So the questions I was asking as I was putting this together and looking to eventually pilot the work was, how are we as community developers increasing knowledge and awareness within, for example, the natural capital arena, if you're familiar with the community capitals? Or how are we increasing awareness within the political capital arena? And each of the conceptual categories, I went through and asked this question over and over again. So thinking about growing behavior and participation, how has the community development work that you all have been doing, how has that grown or changed behavior or participation within the cultural capital or within the social capital? And keep in mind, any of the community capitals could fall under any of these. So I just chose them based on a demonstration. So how are we fostering discourse within our community development work? How are we fostering discourse? Obviously, the one that makes the most sense is within the political capital, but we could be fostering discourse within the social capital, we could be within the human capital, within cultural capital. How are we building capacity? So capacity could be built within a number of different capitals. Again, thinking about asking the question, how is the community development work that has been undertaken, how has that built capacity within human capital, within built capital? And then finally, the long-term outcome that is always the ultimate goal to any project is impacting systems, policy, and conditions. I mentioned that idea of being able to have long-term outcomes or long-term change. So again, thinking about how has the community development work helped to impact systems, helped to impact policies, conditions within social, within political, within natural capital, within the built capital. What has changed? So it took me off and on about a year to kind of come up with these different ideas and to pull this all together. And theoretically, it seems to make sense on paper when I was able to look at it and sort of talk it through with colleagues and do some additional literature review and exploration. However, the work that we do has to be able to be applied within the real world. And so it doesn't make a lot of sense to just create something and then not do anything with it. And so I really wanted to pilot the information, the concepts, the conceptual categories. And so I did a collection of data in conjunction with two colleagues who agreed to work with me, one within Montana and one within Washington State. So within Montana, Paul LaChapelle had a project that he had been working on, looking at facilitating workshops to bring together community members who had been within a town that had been impacted both positively and negatively by oil and gas development. And so he had put together a series of key informant interviews with community members and stakeholders, and let me tag along as a researcher, which I was very grateful for, and ask a couple additional questions to kind of suss out some additional information so that then I would be able to code it using these conceptual categories. So that was the Montana work. Here within Washington State, I've been mentored by a wonderful colleague of mine named Deborah Hansen. And she has been working on extension work for a very long time in Washington State and has done really great work related to the Horizons Project communities. And some of you may be familiar with Horizons. It was set into place about, I guess, 10 years ago now. And the goal was to reduce poverty through the development of leadership. And so leadership activities. And so Extension was one of the players who came in and did some community development work in a large variety of communities across a number of states, and Washington State was one of those. And Deborah had a community that she worked with that she actually maintained a very strong presence with and had continued to assist with community development related work long after the Horizons project had ended. And so her and I went up to her community and conducted a ripple effects mapping with some community members to better understand the work that Extension had been doing over the last decade within the area. So those were my two pilot sites and ways of collecting data. And then what I did once I collected this data was I went back and I analyzed it using the conceptual categories that I'm speaking with you about today. So I created I got a little messed up, sorry about that. I created a framework and then did the analysis. And from there, I wanted to determine whether the framework was supported or not based on that. So I coded the data using the conceptual categories and as, in essence, high-level a priori codes. And they became my hierarchical master coding list, which I'll share with you on the next slide. And so in essence, what I was looking to do was to understand, with all of this data, could this information be applied in a way that made sense, in a way that would be useful for community developers to better understand the work that they were doing. So I created master codes, and then underneath I created subcodes as the data was analyzed. And if you're a qualitative researcher, you know that you don't just analyze data once. So it was recoded several times through there. And through this process, I was going in with the intent to understand the work that had been created, as well as to make fixes where fixes needed to occur. So here's the hierarchical coding scheme that, that I've been talking about in a slightly different view. So I know everyone is different kinds of learners. And so this is more of the hierarchical approach to it. So you see the coding scheme on top. And the 5 conceptual categories are my a priori top codes, which is that idea of increasing knowledge and awareness, growing behavior and participation, fostering discourse, building capacity, and impacting systems, policies, and conditions. And then underneath each of those, I created the next level of codes. And then this is when I came in and looked at the community capitals. And so you can see somewhat examples that I applied. I actually applied all of the community capitals, but there's not room on the slide to show that. So this is more of a demonstration example as opposed to what it actually looked like when I went through and did all the coding. So underneath each conceptual category, there's the next level under, which are your community capitals. So for example, under increased knowledge and awareness, I would have coded to the human capital, to the natural capital, to cultural, to financial, human, social, etc. And then underneath each of those, I created subcodes based on the specific pilot site. There are obviously some similarities across community development work, but not all community development work is going to be exactly identical. So what these conceptual categories are intended to do is to give you an overall framework and a couple level of codes, and then it also allows you to personalize it so that you can understand the data in the best way that makes sense for the work that you're doing. So there would be subcodes, and there's multiple subcodes under each of these. Again, not all those subcodes are listed. I just wanted to provide a demonstration for what they might look like. So taking it to the actual field, here are some of the examples from the specific programs that I was able to uncover. So conceptual category number 1, increased knowledge and awareness. And then you can see the qualitative indicator per category. So under the natural capital arena, there is the idea that improved awareness occurred for available natural assets within the community. So for example, within the Washington State community, community members talked about the idea that there were things that they weren't necessarily aware of that they could make use of, and it was helping them improve their environment. Under the second conceptual category, the growth of behavior and participation. Within the cultural category, we found examples of increased volunteer engagement within the community. And that increased volunteer engagement in turn helped to improve other aspects of the community. Within conceptual category number 3, fostered discourse, we found political, there were some political impacts. So we found increased youth involvement within local government. Under the built capacity, in this case using the financial as our indicator, we found a development of social entrepreneurship to help fulfill community needs. And then finally, under the last long-term impacted systems, policies, and conditions category, we found that there was improved communication among multiple community groups. So as you can see, that's just a sampling of the information and the stories that came out. But from there, what we're able to do is really sort the information in a way that helps to tell the story much more clearly than if we were just to say, yeah, well, within our community, people are doing more work. Instead, this helps to sort it and identify it and tell the story a little bit stronger. So some overall findings as I sort of conclude today and before I turn it on over to Paul. Overall, really one of the primary things I found is that this type of work and these types of qualitative coding framework is best situated to be used to evaluate ongoing in-depth community development work. So in the case where Deborah had been involved in her community for a decade, we received really strong information from the ripple effects mapping, and we were able to really get a lot of great qualitative information from that and speak quite at length to the multiple years and the multiple different levels of work that had occurred. Shorter projects, for example, the project that Paul was involved in was a relatively short-term project in Montana, and those are much more likely to create short-term outcomes. Those are not, those don't get measured as well qualitatively as longer term projects do. So quantitatively, Paul could definitely have, could definitely share some numbers about the impact and the work that they had done, but there were much fewer stories involved in that work than in the Washington State pilot. So really the framework emphasizes the collection of mid and long-term outcomes. So if you're involved or engaged in a community development project that is a year or longer, this would be a framework I would encourage you to use more than if you just came in and taught a couple classes, for example. It's obviously intended to be used as part of a multi-method evaluation. I never recommend that anybody only does either qualitative data collection or quantitative data collection. I think what this helps to do is capture outcomes that reflect the numbers, which was the goal of what I was intending to do. If this is a methodology that is interesting to you, or you'd like to talk a little bit more about it with me, there's my contact information, and then we'll go ahead and share that again at the end. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Paul. So I will stop sharing and let him pick it up.
All right, thank you, Rebecca, and everyone for joining us this morning, this afternoon. Can you hear me okay? Volume's okay? All right. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And just a little bit technically challenged, folks. Thank you for your patience. Let me see if I remember how to do this. Give me a second. Okay. Can you see it? Is it there? All right, thanks, Mark. Appreciate that. So, you know, this is kind of a common response, I think, about qualitative data is, oh my God, the data set is huge, it's time consuming, how am I going to analyze, you know, these pages or hours and hours of content, and then how do I report this stuff? But I'm here to say, don't panic. Qualitative data collection, analysis, and reporting does not need to be daunting. I'm going to share a couple of examples where I've used this and where I think that this was the better approach of the in terms of trying to understand a situation and the impacts from a program. So the first example I want to talk about is some work I've been doing with the some tribal communities on the Crow Indian Reservation, just east of here in south central Montana. The Crow Reservation is our largest reservation in terms of population and size. And I've been working with Crow Indians now for about 8 years, on and off as funding has allowed. But we, with some colleagues here on campus, we started a process called a participatory, community-based participatory research project. So instead of going in and dictating to the community, these are the problems, and this is how the quote-unquote experts from the community are going to come in and solve the problems, we opened it up to the community and said, we've got a small amount of money. We're here to help facilitate, but ultimately you're the experts, and you tell us what you think are the issues related to community health, men's health in particular, and how do we study it, how do we evaluate it, and hopefully ultimately how do we implement a program to address it. So that was the Crow Men's Health Project, and one of the things that we did was we came up with a series of questions, and working with some colleagues in our film department, we actually created this DVD, and this kind of documents the evaluation process that we did. And if you click on that link that I have on the screen there, you can actually see watch the 10-minute video. But this was just a way for us to capture and share with the community what some of the key individuals involved in the community health project were saying, what they were thinking, what they thought the impacts of the program were. The reason that I think that this worked so well in a tribal context, and I think really in any, it lends itself to any community development project, is that we are, I think that we are, as people that have relationships, that relate to each other, that that focus on the quality of those relationships, I think that those relationships can best be described and defined and understood through the use of stories. And I probably don't need to tell you that in a Native context, the use of stories is how knowledge is passed down. It's how people interact in a formal and informal setting. And in fact, for many of the formal meetings that we had leading up to the work, they would start with stories around the meeting room table, mostly the elders sharing thoughts on context and experiences that they had. So stories resonate with many people, and they feel more comfortable, I would argue, than sitting down and telling their story, than sitting down and filling out on a Likert scale from 1 to 5 how trust has been enhanced or how relationships have changed as a result of a project. So what I did was, of course, got permission through our institutional review board on campus to do research, and of course had a consent form and permission from the Native community to record the stories. But I found that recording the stories and creating an empirical record, a data set that I'll talk about in a second, was for me the most effective way to try to document change. It's very difficult to try to take notes as you're listening to on a one-on-one interview or in a group situation, and you can be a much more active listener in that situation to respond with follow-up questions and to really be a part of that that process of gathering that information. And more importantly, I would say more so than a quantitative survey, the words matter. The words from the person's perspective matter. Rebecca talked about a priori kind of instruments or coming in with themes and words, and I think that there's a place for that, of course. But when you go in with a very blank slate or have an interview schedule that's very open to say, let's talk about your experiences with this program, the words come out from their perspective that I think can be very powerful, and they can also go in places that you weren't anticipating, and those tangents are a good thing. I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing to have data that's would be considered an outlier if it's a rich and descriptive data set that helps you better understand from their perspective. So once you have the recording, it's up to you to, if you want to transcribe that recording verbatim, or just have an empirical record that you can access and listen to in whatever way you want. I don't need to tell you all that these things now are really powerful tools for recording interviews, and you can just use your smartphone now. Many of them have a free app that come with the operating system, and it's really easy to capture stories digitally now and have that empirical record, that data set that you can use and access and ultimately report on. So that's the first project I wanted to share with you. The second project is a USDA-funded rural development project looking at community foundations and educating our states and community foundation board members about a number of topics, technical assistance and training topics that we offered. It was a three-year collaborative project through Extension and some other partners around the state. And our goal was really just to establish or build existing community foundations across Montana. We provided technical assistance in a number of areas, just kind of Community Foundations 101, asset development, grant making, strategic planning, community dialogue, leadership, etc. So we offered community-based, regional, and then statewide events and convenings to bring people together to offer content in these areas. So I wanted to try to understand the impacts of the program and ultimately the impacts that were taking place in communities as a result. So I created an online survey through SurveyMonkey, and it did have quantitative and qualitative response options. We did pre-testing, which is absolutely essential to understand wording and verbiage to make sure that you're not offering too technical a term, or that the lay person or the person that was involved in the training has a good understanding of. We emailed the requests in 2015. Survey was open for 6 weeks. We had a response rate of about 36%, total responses from 43 individuals. So I want to talk about the qualitative portion of this. So we did have some Likert scale, strongly agree, strongly disagree questions and items about the program. But to me, what was really interesting were these open-ended responses. Question and responses we got. So for example, how has the program influenced the development of leadership skills for you and within the community? How has this program influenced community deliberation and engagement about its future? Provide examples. please describe the changes in trust you observed between the Community Foundation board members and within your community. The reason we have these topics is simply because this was the written into the grant proposal, was to develop these skills and technical areas. So we asked specifically about these topics, but we left the opportunity open for respondents to answer this question however they wanted to. Just a few other examples. We had 3 additional questions. One of the primary goals was to increase skills and knowledge. Describe if and how the local extension agent is more aware, acting as an advocate. The next question, what are the primary benefits? And then what changes would you suggest to improve the Community Foundation education program? So let me talk a little bit about the data analysis now. So that's how we collected the data through an online survey, and now starts the analysis. And I'm just going to offer one example through this one theme of leadership skills and some of the sub themes or sub codes, as Rebecca had said, dealing with leadership. So what I did was these are the actual responses from the individuals, and this is just a small section of a sample of the sample. But you can see what I did here is I'm reading through the open-ended responses, and I'm looking for keywords that I think best describe or have some kind of cohesive theme to them, some idea that's expressed across the sample. And you can see here I'm circling words, and this is actually what I did. I printed out this the responses, and I actually circled them in different colors, what I consider to be different themes or codes associated with this area of leadership. So you can see here this topic of awareness comes up. Individual talked about confidence, focus, and support. And so I go through these, and again, multiple iterations, reading through this, talking with my colleagues, and sharing with them the data set as well, so that there's some corroboration there, so that we're actually in agreement. And as a result of that, what I come up with is a kind of a final table of that I think explains in this area the 3 themes that came out associated with leadership or leadership skills. And so this third theme has to do with increased awareness and confidence. And I'm actually presenting the data as it was presented from the respondents. And you can see there were 3 themes that came out of the data set having to do with educational content, motivation, and awareness and confidence. Now, I think you can always argue, and this is always kind of the bit of subjectivity when it comes to qualitative data analysis and reporting is, are these distinct themes? Is there overlap? Can you lump? Can you split? And you can have that kind of academic discussion, I think. But the point is to be able to list and describe your themes and do it in a way that's convincing to the reader. And so what I've tried to do here again is created this theme, again based in part on the words that the people used, and then I actually present the empirical evidence to support that the justification of that theme or that description. So let me just conclude with some thoughts here with in terms of qualitative data collection and analysis and reporting. It doesn't need to be a complicated process in terms of collecting and analyzing data. Again, you can use, can be as simple as turning on your smartphone, getting consent, and recording the conversation, going back, listening to it, and doing a level of analysis that I think should contain 3 important factors. There should be a degree of rigor to your analysis, that it should be based on a thorough data set, that it's not just kind of hand scribbled notes, but you actually have the words from the individual or a recorded interview. and that ultimately this be open to the peer review process, and that you provide that data set and make it accessible to your peers so that they can also hopefully come to the same conclusions. One of the issues that comes up is, how do you know when you have a representative sample? And what I started to see from the data set with the last example I showed you was some degree of repetition, and or what is often referred to as saturation. So you're hearing the same things, and then if you do a non-response bias, you're checking with the people that didn't respond, and you're asking them, you're hearing the same thing there, that you can be. I think you can make a convincing argument that your sample is representative, that you're hearing the same thing from these individuals and from the non-respondents. And then just some concluding responses in terms of reporting. Pay attention, of course, to issues of anonymity and confidentiality in that data set. And sometimes it can be subtle, the words that people use or the references that people make in certain contexts. You want to protect the individual, and you want to protect what they say. So that's issues of anonymity and confidentiality. Ultimately, you want to offer examples from your data set, which is what I did in that table. Actually offered the quotes from the open-ended surveys. And lastly, I think it's critical to offer and provide the entire data set in an appendix or a cloud, because data storage is not an issue anymore. It's really easy to make these data sets available to our peers and ask them to come to the same conclusions based on the results that you offer. So with that, I'll say thank you, and maybe turn it back over to Rebecca. I'm not sure if we have time for questions, or if we'll take them via the chat, but that's all I had. Thank you very much.
We do have time for questions. Our intent was to leave it with enough time in case anyone wanted to dialogue with us. I'm going to go ahead and mute and let Catherine take over at this point.
Okay, yes, please everyone put any questions or comments you have in the chat box. Also, I'm going to be posting in the chat box a link to a survey. We'd love to hear your feedback on today's webinar, so please, if you could, go to that survey link. Also included are both email addresses for Rebecca and Paul, so you can get in touch with them. And then finally, the website where you can review this recording later and previous webinars. So I'll go ahead and put that into the chat box. And of course, we ask, if you do have any questions, go ahead and type them in. We do have about 15 minutes to take questions, so please feel free. Paul, looks like you have a couple questions coming in, if you can see those.
I do, yeah. That's a great question, Mary. And I'll just read it out loud here. Oh, I'm sorry, no, it was from somebody else. Have you combined, Paul, would you ground your qualitative approach in any particular tradition? As a graduate student, the professor I worked with talked a lot about hermeneutics. And if you're familiar with hermeneutics, traditionally it was the study of the Bible and the interpretation of the translation of the Bible into different languages, and how those different words meant different things in different contexts. And so I guess the hermeneutic approach, which is the interpretation of words and phrases and words together and words in terms of how they relate to the context, would be the tradition that I was kind of grounded in or learned from. Rebecca, anything you want to add to that?
Generally speaking, my qualitative background is really within qualitative research. And so I tend to take more of a systems approach to the work I'm doing to kind of understand the context.
I see another question. How have you combined your data with community foundations with any quantitative data collected? I just presented them, and I have a paper now in review in community development, just presented them side by side. So I've got the, and I just did, because the sample size was so small, nothing too sophisticated in terms of statistical analysis, but just simple percentages of people and how they reported on changes in terms of leadership and use of the technical information. I see one other question here. Talk about IRB, particularly if you're making data public instead of destroying it. And so for us here at my university, I'm sure it's similar at yours. It's a process that's mandated, but we do have, if we're not dealing with vulnerable populations, youth, and there's of course a whole list, we usually are exempt from kind of a thorough review, and but it's something that that everyone here at the university has to go through. One thing that's come up with us at our university, Rebecca, I'd be curious if you have any thoughts about the difference between program evaluation and research, and whether with our program evaluation, whether we need to do IRB, you know, go through an IRB process. And so far, I think we've kind of operated under the radar there. But to me, it's, you know, it's still research, and we're asking people for their input. We're asking people for data, and so it's one of those gray areas. So be curious what your thoughts are there on that, Rebecca.
Yes, so technically at Washington State University, if you're collecting evaluation data and you plan to use it just for evaluation purposes, meaning to perhaps do program improvement, you don't need to do even an exempt process through IRB. However, as a rule of thumb, I encourage everybody that I work with to go through the IRB process, regardless if they're titling it evaluation or research, because I agree exactly with the same thing you're saying, Paul. We're collecting information, and typically, whether you work within extension or not, there's the expectation that you share your data with the public, that you're working with, whether it's county commissioners or funders, or you're talking at a conference about the work you're doing, you're publishing it. If you do any types of those things, even if it's just quote unquote evaluation, you have to go through an IRB. So to be on the safe side, I default to, I'd rather have people do the IRB than not.
I see another question's come up. Do either of you have experiences with evaluating microloan program that impact your respective communities? I don't, Jessica, but I do know that it's really easy to kind of default to, you know, just kind of going with the questions about, you know, how much money, who was impacted, what were the programs, but think about the rich data set that you can talk about in terms of what Rebecca talked about with different capital, social capital and political capital. How has this affected transparency in a community? Or maybe questions that you wouldn't normally think of in a survey, to ask people to just share their thoughts about that outside of the kind of the financial and fiscal indicators that we would normally think of. Rebecca, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I don't. I also have not done anything related to microloans with anybody here at Washington State. So unfortunately, I can't chime in much about anything personal that I've had experience with. Sorry. And yeah, Mary mentioned the good point that IRB varies by university. So the recommendation that you speak with your individual university first. And I think both Paul and I would definitely agree with that. And Allison Teeter chimed in that at Kansas State, they submit IRBs for every evaluation, which it sounds like our protocol is as well. Does anyone have any more questions?
I see a question here. I mentioned that I have a paper under review. Do either of you have published papers with sample methods to review? I do on my website, and I can put the URL in here. A lot of my work is qualitative, and so lots of examples. And I think journals now are becoming much more open if you can deal with the space requirements, to presenting qualitative data in a table and doing it in a way. I just saw an article in Nature that offers qualitative data about climate change and mental health issues. So I think we're seeing qualitative data represented to a greater degree in our peer-reviewed journals, and I think editors are more open to accepting and presenting those data.
All right, if there's no other questions, we will go ahead and sign off. Again, please take the time to do that survey that I put into the chat box. We really do appreciate your feedback. I want to thank Paul and Rebecca again for joining us and taking time out of their day to share some really great information with us. Again, you can view this recording at the RDC website, which again is in the chat box. And if Rebecca and Paul will be willing, I would be more than happy to share these PowerPoints with all of you via email. So I will get with them on that. But other than that, thank you guys so much for joining us. And we will go ahead and sign off.
And I'll say thank you as well. We appreciate it. Have a good afternoon.